We've been talking about cellular transport. So again, when you say cellular transport, it is not the cells that are being transported. It is the materials. These are the molecules that are being transported in and out of the cell because, of course, remember that your cell membrane, the membrane of the cells, are selectively permeable, which means that they only allow certain types of molecules to pass through them easily. And so for the rest of your molecules, again, what they use are the different types of cellular transport mechanisms that we have. Now, again, also remember that all these transports that we have, all this exchange of the different substances in or out of the cell, its main goal is for homeostasis. Okay, so again, any of your responses towards any type of stimulus, that is a form of homeostasis. Okay, if you have been exercising, if you've lost a lot of water through your sweat, you're feeling thirsty, that is still for homeostasis. If you are taking your medicine because you have fever, that is still for homeostasis. If you are using a fan or your air conditioner because it's too hot, that is for homeostasis. Okay, if you are using your jacket or your coat, for example, because it's too cold, that is still for homeostasis. Again, so any types of responses that an organism does, okay, for certain types of stimulus, that is going to be for homeostasis. So again, when you say homeostasis, that is the state of internal balance within our body, within our systems. Okay, so again, cellular transport, the transport of materials in and out of the cell. The main goal for this is to maintain homeostasis. Now, we've talked about the two types of cellular transport. We've said your passive transport is a type of transport that does not use energy, okay? Doesn't use energy in the form of ATP. And the movement of materials will be from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And that means from an area where there is higher amount of a certain molecule to an area where there is lower amount of that molecule, okay? Or sometimes we say passive transport moves materials down the concentration gradient. Okay, so again, when you say concentration gradient, this is the difference in the amount of materials, in the amount of molecules in your system, in your space. Okay, so again, when you say passive transport, it does not use energy in the form of ATP. The movement of material is going to be from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, or we say down the concentration gradient. Okay, now remember, since it does not use ATP, which is the energy in your cell, what it uses is just kinetic energy. Okay, energy which is caused by the movement of molecules, movement of particles within a cell. Now, the second type of cellular transport here, which is going to be our focus today, is active transport. If your passive transport does not use ATP, active transport, on the other hand, uses ATP. Okay, so this one uses ATP. And if your passive transport moves materials from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, or down the concentration gradient, your active transport is the opposite. Okay, it is the opposite. That means it moves materials from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. Or sometimes we say it moves materials against the concentration gradient. Okay, so again, those are the two major differences between these two types of transport. Passive transport does not use ATP, or the energy currency of the cell. Active transport uses energy in the form of ATP. Passive transport moves substances from an area where there is more of that substance to an area where there is less of that substance. For your active transport, it is going to be the opposite. Okay, so it moves materials from an area where there is less of that materials to an area where there is more of that materials. Okay, so they are essentially the opposites of one another. Now, we've also talked about the different types of passive transport that you have. Again, when you say diffusion, this is just the transport of materials from a higher concentration or area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Now, sometimes we use the terms simple diffusion. Okay, we sometimes use the term simple. That is just to differentiate your simple diffusion from facilitated diffusion. Again, facilitated diffusion is just like diffusion, but it uses your membrane protein proteins. Remember, you have two types of membrane proteins. Your channel protein, it only has a channel, an alley, like a canal where your materials can easily pass through. And the other type would be your carrier protein. Your carrier protein really carries the materials, okay? So it engulfs the materials and carries it or expels it inside or maybe outside of the cell. Okay, so again, that's the major difference between your diffusion, simple diffusion, and facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion here uses membrane proteins. Now, yesterday we've talked about osmosis. Okay, we said osmosis is just a special type of diffusion. It is the diffusion of water molecules through a selectively permeable membrane. So if you are talking about water molecules passing in and out of the cell or going in or out of the cell, that is just osmosis, okay? Because of course your cell membrane is a selectively permeable membrane. So again, these are the three different types of passive transport. Movement of materials are going to be in the same direction from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And of course, there is no use of ATP, okay? Now today again, but before we go to your active transport, we've talked about the different types of solutions yesterday. We said there is an isotonic solution. Again, when you say iso, that means balanced. Okay, so amount of materials inside the cell and outside of the cell are more or less the same. When you say hypotonic solution, again, hypo means low, and it is low in terms of solutes. Okay, so when you say hypotonic solution, very low solutes, but very high water content. Okay, it has lots of water. Now, if you have your hypertonic solution, it is the opposite of your hypotonic solution. That means it has a very large amount of solutes, and so it is going to have very little amounts of water in it. Now remember, this is about osmosis, and osmosis, the direction of your movement of water molecules would still be just like your passive transport. Okay, so that's from an area where there is more water molecules to an area where there is less water molecules. So if you put your cell again in a hypotonic solution, again, hypotonic solution is going to have more water molecules. Okay, there's going to have more water molecules. And so what happens is that water molecules will get inside the cell. Okay, so eventually your cell is going to swell. Now, if you have a hypertonic solution, on the other hand, it is going to be the opposite. Your cell has more water molecules than the solution. And so what happens is that the water molecules from inside the cell is going to go out. They're going to go out of your cell towards the solution. So in return, your cell is going to shrink. Okay, or sometimes we call this, in plants, we call this plasmolysis. Okay, so again, remember, hypertonic solution, the cell will shrink. Hypotonic solution, the cell will swell. Okay, so hyper shrink, hypo swell. Okay, now, so if you have this as your U-tube, okay, so this is your U-tube or U-shaped flask, and you have your two types of solution here, your hypotonic solution, hypertonic solution. Again, in terms of solutes, your hypertonic solution is going to have lots of solutes in them. Okay, so this one has lots of solutes. This one, your hypotonic solution, has less amounts of solutes, which means that it has more amount of water. And so the direction of osmosis will be from this area, since it has more amount of water, to this area, to this side that you have here. So eventually, they are going to have the same amount of solutes. The left side and the right side are going to have the same amount of solutes, but the right side of your U-tube here is going to increase the volume because, of course, your water molecules moved from the left side going to the right side. Okay, so eventually, again, all these solutions, your left side and your right side now are isotonic, more or less the same amount of solutes. But then again, this side here, your right side, that's going to be increasing its volume because the water molecules from your hypotonic solution, originally from your left side, went to the right side of your U-tube. Okay, so that's your hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic solutions. Again, hypertonic solutions, the cell will shrink. Hypotonic solutions, the cell will swell. Okay, now today's topic, of course, is active transport. As I have mentioned, your active transport here uses energy. in the form of ATP. And the movement of your molecules would be against the concentration gradient, which means that the movement is going to be from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. It is the opposite of your passive transport. Now, you also use your proteins, your membrane proteins in your active transport, just like your facilitated diffusion. There is also the use of your membrane proteins, but the membrane proteins here are called protein pumps. Okay, so we call these membrane proteins here protein pumps because, of course, they need to pump those molecules because they are actually working against the concentration gradient. Okay, so again, the movement is from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration, higher amounts. It's the opposite of your passive transport. Now, you have several types of active transport here. The first one would be your exocytosis, and the second one would be endocytosis. Now, again, when you say cytosis, this means the cell. Okay, so this means cytoplasm, which means the cell. Exo in science, of course, this means going out, and endo means getting inside. Okay, so when you say exocytosis, materials exit the cell. Okay, so this is a type of active transport where your materials would exit the cell. So this here is an example of your exocytosis. Okay, so materials inside the cell are expelled outside. Okay, that's exocytosis. Now for your endocytosis, again, endo means going inside. So here you mean materials enter the cell. Okay, so here is an example of your endocytosis. Materials from outside are going to be engulfed by the cell. It is going to be your cell membrane. The cell membrane is going to be forming vesicles. And of course, those materials are going to be transported inside the cell. Now, you have two types for this depending on the size of the material. You have pinocytosis, which is endocytosis of small materials. Okay, endocytosis of small materials, we call that pinocytosis. And so sometimes it's also called cell drinking. Okay, cell drinking. Now the other one is phagocytosis. This is endocytosis of larger materials. Okay, larger molecules, larger materials. And so sometimes we call this cell eating. Okay, so again, these are the two types of active transport: exocytosis, expelling materials out of the cell; endocytosis, your materials would enter the cell. Two types for this: pinocytosis for smaller molecules, and this is also called cell drinking; and phagocytosis for larger materials, this is called cell eating. Okay, so again, those are the different types of your active transport. Again, passive transport, active transport, even if they are opposites, their main goal still is to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so whatever is in excess is going to be expelled. Whatever is missing inside the cell is going to be replenished. Okay, that's still for homeostasis. Now here is an illustration of your exocytosis. So again, exocytosis, going out of the cell. So your vesicle here with some substances that's going to merge with the plasma membrane, and eventually the materials are of course going to be expelled out of the cell. Now this here is your pinocytosis, an example of endocytosis, smaller molecules here. And so the smaller molecules are going to be engulfed by your cell membrane, and of course the cell membrane is going to form vesicles. Eventually these materials are going to be incorporated inside the cell. Now phagocytosis, again, this is endocytosis of bigger molecules. So in here you have this substance being engulfed by your cell membrane, also forming your vacuole instead of a vesicle, because of course your material here is bigger. And of course eventually this material is going to be expelled, or it's going to be incorporated within the cell. Okay, it's going to be used inside the cell. So again, those are the different types of active transport. Now another very important part of your active transport is your sodium-potassium pump. Okay, this is a very important form of active transport that keeps our muscles functioning. Okay, without this, your muscles are not going to function well. Without this, you are going to have difficulty with your heart. Okay, because of course the heart is the most important muscle in our body. Okay, so in here, in your sodium-potassium pump, you start with your 3 sodium ions. Okay, so you have 3 sodium ions, and these ions are going to be attached to your pump. Again, this is your protein pump, a membrane protein that plays a role in your active transport. Okay, so 3 ions of sodium, that's going to be attached to your sodium-potassium pump. And then if you have an ATP, okay, in your ATP, again, that's adenosine triphosphate. That means there is an adenosine sugar here, and you have 3 phosphate groups. Now, the energy in your ATP is actually concentrated in the phosphate groups, okay? Now, what happens here is that one of the phosphate groups of your ATP is going to get detached, and that is going to merge with your pump here, okay? So it's going to get attached to your pump. So in return, you have 3 sodium ions here and a phosphate group, okay? When that happens, your pump is going to change its shape, and eventually those 3 ions of sodium are going to be expelled out of the cell. Now, when that happens, 2 ions of potassium are going to take their place here, going to take the other side, or going to take the space here at the other side of your pump. And this phosphate group that you have in your membrane proteins, or your protein pumps, that is going to go back to your ADP here, eventually reforming the ATP again. Okay, so it's going to reform your ATP. And of course, these potassium ions are going to be incorporated in the cell. Okay, so that's your sodium-potassium pump. To make it easier for you to understand, this is our animation. So again, you have 3 ions of sodium. You have 1 phosphate group coming from your ATP that is going to change your protein pump. Eventually, those sodium ions are going to be expelled through, or 2 ions of potassium are going to take their place, and that phosphate group is going to be returned to your ADP, reforming your ATP. Okay, so again, that is your sodium-potassium pump, one very important active transport that happens in our cells. Okay, any questions? Make sure that you are listening. These are all going to be part of your common assessment. All right, now to summarize it all, if we are going to use an analogy for your passive transport, active transport, if you have your passive transport, it is like going downhill. Okay, if you are from uphill going downhill, of course, you have your passive transport. The movement of materials will be from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Again, of course, if you are going downhill, you don't really need to use a lot of energy. Okay, so your passive transport does not use ATP, does not use energy. Okay, so again, that's passive transport going downhill from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration without the use of energy. Now, when you have active transport, it is like going uphill. Okay, so that means you need to use energy. Of course, it's going to be very difficult to go uphill. And of course, the movement of materials will be from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. Okay, so that's the major differences between your passive transport and active transport. Now, these are the differences again between your passive transport. It does not use energy in the form of ATP. Active transport uses ATP, the form of energy that we have in the cell. Passive transport, the movement of your molecules will be from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. That means down the concentration gradient. Active transport, it is from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration, or against the concentration gradient. Examples of passive transport, we have diffusion, facilitated diffusion. The difference, of course, is that facilitated diffusion uses membrane proteins. And osmosis, a special type of diffusion, which involves water molecules. Now, exocytosis and endocytosis are examples of your active transport. Exo is expelling materials out of the cell. Endo is engulfing materials. If those are smaller molecules, then that is going to be pinocytosis. If those are bigger molecules, then that would be called phagocytosis. Now, what are some types of substances that can be transported using the different types of transport that we have here? Passive transport, there are soluble molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, monosaccharides, your simple sugar, sex hormones, and water. Now, for your active transport, you have complex sugars, large cells, ions, and proteins. Okay, so again, these are the differences between passive transport and active transport.